For decades, the world has wondered what really happened between Paul McCartney and George Harrison. Were they rivals, best friends, or something far more complicated? Together, they helped change music forever as members of Beatles. Yet behind the unforgettable songs were creative disagreements, personal growth, moment of tension, and a friendship that evolved over decades. In recent years, Paul has reflected openly on George's talent, humor, and lasting influence, offering a more complete picture than many fans ever knew. So, what has Paul really said about George Harrison? The answer reveals a story of respect, regret, laughter, and one of music's greatest friendships. Before the screaming crowds, before the sold-out stadiums, before history called them the Beatles, two boys from Liverpool were simply trying to make music. Neither of them knew they were about to help change the world forever. Paul McCartney was born in Liverpool in 1942. From an early age, music filled his home. His father loved jazz and encouraged Paul to learn different instruments. But Paul's childhood wasn't without heartbreak. When he was just 14 years old, his mother, Mary, died from complications related to cancer. The loss left a deep mark on him. Music became more than a hobby. It became a way to cope. Just a year earlier, another Liverpool teenager had experienced a similar tragedy. John Lennon had also lost his mother at a young age. That shared pain created an unspoken bond between the two boys when they first met in 1957. Paul soon joined John's skiffle group, the Quarrymen. Not long after, Paul had someone else in mind, a quiet, talented guitarist who was younger than both of them. His name was George Harrison. At first, John wasn't convinced. George was only 14 years old. He seemed too young to join the group, but Paul believed in his friend. He knew George had extraordinary talent. To prove himself, George famously played a guitar solo during a bus ride for John. His skill impressed everyone. Soon, he became part of the band. That moment changed music history. The three teenagers spent countless hours practicing, playing small clubs, traveling long distances for little money, learning how to perform together. Those early years weren't glamorous. There were long nights, tiny audiences, broken equipment, and constant uncertainty. But they never stopped believing. Eventually, the group evolved into the Beatles with the addition of Ringo Starr. No one could have imagined what would happen next. Beatlemania exploded. Fans screamed so loudly at concerts that the band could barely hear themselves play. Every new song became an event. Every album pushed music in a new direction. Paul quickly became known as one of the band's main songwriters alongside John Lennon. George, meanwhile, was often seen as a quiet Beatle. But that label never told the whole story. Behind the scenes, George was growing rapidly as both a guitarist and songwriter. He admired Indian music. He explored new sounds. He constantly challenged himself to become a better musician. Paul later spoke many times about George's remarkable musical abilities, especially his instinctive guitar playing and his unique approach to songwriting. Even during the band's earliest years, Paul recognized that George brought something to Beatles that no one else could. Their friendship also extended beyond the stage. They laughed together, traveled together, shared unforgettable experiences that only the four Beatles could truly understand. They were more than bandmates. For much of their youth, they were family. Here's something to think about. Have you ever had a friend who believed in you before anyone else did? Someone who saw your potential long before the rest of the world? Tell us about that person in the comments. As the 1960s continued, the Beatles became bigger than anyone thought possible. Success brought wealth, worldwide fame, creative freedom, but it also brought something far more difficult: pressure. Each member was growing, not just as a musician, but as a person. George wanted more opportunities to write. Paul pushed for perfection in the studio. John's interests were changing. Creative differences slowly began appearing. At first, they seemed small, but over time, those differences would test one of the greatest partnerships in music history. The world still saw four smiling Beatles behind the studio doors. A much more complicated story was beginning. At the height of Beatlemania, the world saw perfection. For young men smiling for cameras, making history with every album. breaking records almost every month. But behind the scenes, life inside the Beatles was becoming increasingly complicated. Success brought unlimited opportunities. It also brought enormous pressure. By the mid to late 1960s, each Beatle was growing in a different direction. Paul McCartney was known for his incredible attention to detail. He often arrived at recording sessions with clear ideas about arrangements, harmonies, and how songs should sound. Many admired his leadership. Others sometimes found his perfectionism difficult. Paul wasn't trying to control the band. He wanted every song to be the best it could possibly be. But not everyone always agreed with his approach. At the same time, George Harrison was changing rapidly as an artist. For years, most Beatles albums were dominated by songs written by Paul McCartney and John Lennon. George contributed fewer songs. Not because he lacked talent, but because the Lennon-McCartney partnership naturally received most of the attention. Still, George kept writing, kept learning, kept improving. Eventually, his songwriting reached an extraordinary level. Songs like While My Guitar Gently Weeps Something and Here Comes the Sun prove that George had become one of the finest songwriters in the world. Paul himself has praised Something on multiple occasions, calling it one of the greatest love songs ever written, and recognizing George's remarkable growth as a composer. That praise reflected genuine respect. But it didn't erase the challenges inside the band. Recording sessions sometimes became tense. Creative opinions clashed. George occasionally felt frustrated that his songs received less space on Beatles albums than he believed they deserved. Paul, meanwhile, was trying to keep the band productive during a period when their future felt increasingly uncertain. One of the clearest examples came during the filming of the Let It Be sessions. The cameras captured real creative disagreements. In one memorable exchange, George calmly told Paul that he would play whatever Paul wanted, or not play at all if that made him happier. The moment has often been interpreted as evidence of deep hostility. The reality was more complex. Bands that spend years creating together naturally experience disagreements, especially when each member is growing creatively. The footage showed honest conversations under immense pressure, not the complete story of their friendship. Here's something to think about. Do you believe disagreements are a sign that a friendship is failing, or can they happen because people care deeply about creating something great? Share your opinion in the comments. By 1970, the Beatles had come to an end. For fans, it was heartbreaking. The greatest band in the world was no more. The breakup led to legal disputes, business disagreements, and emotional distance among the members. Like many close friends after a difficult chapter, they needed time apart. Yet time has a way of changing perspective. As the years passed, many of the sharp emotions softened. Paul and George each built successful solo careers. They occasionally collaborated again and gradually rebuilt their personal relationship. It was exactly the same as the early Liverpool days, but it didn't need to be. Both men had matured, both had changed, and both came to appreciate what they had accomplished together. Years later, when Paul looked back on George Harrison, he didn't focus on old arguments. He focused on the laughter, the talent, the kindness, and the extraordinary musician his younger friend had become. In the next chapter, we'll explore what Paul McCartney has actually said about George Harrison over the years, and why his heartfelt reflections reveal a friendship far deeper than many fans ever realized. If you enjoy uncovering the true stories behind music's greatest legends, subscribe now. The next chapter reveals Paul's own words about George, and they paint a very different picture from the rumors that have followed the Beatles for decades. When people talk about the Beatles, they often focus on the disagreements, the arguments, breakup, the business battles. Those moments certainly have the peened, but they don't tell the whole story. If you listen carefully to Paul McCartney in interviews over the past 2 decades, a very different picture begins to emerge, one filled with admiration, respect, and affection for George Harrison. Paul has often described George as someone with a wonderful sense of humor. Away from the cameras, George loved making people laugh. He could be witty, dry, unexpectedly funny. According to Paul, George's humor was one of the things that made being around him so enjoyable. But it wasn't just George's personality that Paul admired. It was his remarkable growth as a musician. When George joined the band as a teenager, He was the youngest Beatle. For years, he quietly watched Paul and John Lennon write hit after hit. Instead of becoming discouraged, George kept learning. He studied different styles of music. He experimented with new sounds. He practiced constantly. Paul has repeatedly praised George's evolution, saying he developed into an exceptional songwriter whose work stood alongside the very best. One song, in particular, has always stood out, Something, written by George Harrison and released on the Beatles' 1969 album Abbey Road. The song quickly became one of the band's most celebrated recordings. Paul has called it one of the greatest love songs ever written. Coming from someone who co-wrote countless classics himself, that praise carries enormous weight. It showed that admiration had replaced any old creative rivalry. After George's passing in November 2001, Paul spoke with deep emotion about losing not only a former bandmate, but a lifelong friend. He remembered the early Liverpool days, the endless rehearsals, the excitement of discovering music together, and the incredible journey they shared. In interviews, Paul acknowledged that, like any close friends who spend years together, they had disagreements. But he never allowed those disagreements to define George's memory. Instead, he focused on gratitude. Gratitude that they had shared experiences few people could ever imagine. Gratitude that George's music continues to inspire millions. And gratitude for friendship they built over decades. Here's something to think about. As we grow older, many old disagreements seem much smaller than they once did. Have you ever reconnected with someone after years apart and realized a friendship mattered more than the conflict? Share your thoughts in the comments. Paul has also spoken warmly about George's spiritual side. While George's interest in Indian philosophy and meditation sometimes surprised people during the Beatles' years, Paul later recognized how deeply those beliefs shaped George's life. They gave him peace, perspective, and a unique outlook that influenced both his music and his relationships. Perhaps that's why Paul's memories of George rarely focus on fame. Instead, they focus on the person behind the legend, the young guitarist on the bus trying to impress John Lennon, the friend who loved a clever joke, the songwriter who refused to stop growing, the man whose quiet wisdom left a lasting impression on everyone around him. But even as Paul reflected on those memories, one chapter remained especially difficult to discuss: George's final years, his battle with serious illness, an emotional goodbye that marked the end of one of music's greatest friendships. The next chapter explores those final moments and why Paul's memories reveal a bond that endured long after the Beatles had gone their separate ways. Everyone experiences seasons when relationships change. Sometimes distance, time, or disagreements get in the way. But the people who truly shape our lives often remain part of our story forever, no matter where life takes us. By the late 1990s, the excitement of Beatlemania had become history. The screaming crowds were gone. The endless tours had ended decades earlier. But the bond between the four Beatles had never completely disappeared. Time had changed them. It had softened old disagreements, and it had given each of them a chance to appreciate what they had built together. Then, life delivered another painful challenge. In 1997, George Harrison announced that he had been treated for throat cancer. In the years that followed, he continued facing serious health problems. As if that wasn't enough, in December 1999, George survived a terrifying attack when an intruder broke into his home in England. He and his wife, Olivia Harrison, fought back until police arrived, and George later recovered from his injuries. Despite these hardships, George continued spending time with the people closest to him. He remained devoted to music, to family, and to the spiritual beliefs that had guided him for much of his life. His calm outlook helped him face enormous challenges with remarkable courage. As George's health declined in 2001, those who loved him knew time was becoming precious. On November 29, 2001, George Harrison passed away at the age of 58 after battling cancer. The news shocked music lovers across the world. Tributes poured in from fellow musicians, world leaders, and millions of fans. For Paul McCartney, it was the loss of someone he had known since they were teenagers. Someone who had shared an extraordinary journey that no one else could truly understand. Paul later reflected on George with warmth rather than sadness alone. He remembered the young guitarist who had impressed everyone with his talent, the friend who loved to laugh, the musician who constantly challenged himself to grow. One memory has become especially meaningful to Beatles fans. Paul has recalled visiting George during his final illness and spending quiet time together, rather than focusing on fame or old disagreements. The conversation reflected years of friendship and mutual understanding. Those simple moments became memories Paul had continued to treasure. At George's memorial events and in later interviews, Paul consistently emphasized gratitude. Gratitude for the music they created, gratitude for the friendship they shared, and gratitude that George's influence continues to live on through his songs. Here's something to think about. If you had one more chance to thank someone who changed your life, what would you say? Let us know in the comments. Over the years, Paul has continued honoring George in meaningful ways. During concerts, he has performed George's songs. He has shared personal stories that reveal George's kindness and humor. And whenever people ask about the Beatles, Paul often reminds audiences that George wasn't just an extraordinary guitarist. He was an extraordinary human being. That may be the greatest tribute of all. Not remembering someone only for their achievements, but remembering the person they were when the cameras weren't rolling. As the years have passed, fans have come to realize something important. The story of Paul and George was never simply about creative disagreements. It was about two boys from Liverpool who grew into global icons, faced incredible pressures, made mistakes, forgave one another, and never stopped respecting each other's talent. In the final chapter, we'll explore why their friendship continues to inspire musicians around the world, and why the legacy they built together remains one of the greatest in music history. If you enjoy discovering the true stories behind legendary artists, subscribe now. Our next documentary explores another unforgettable friendship that changed music forever and the hidden story behind its greatest moments. More than half a century has passed since four young men from Liverpool changed popular music forever. New artists have broken records. New genres have emerged. New generations have discovered their own musical heroes. Yet the Beatles continue to inspire millions around the world. And a big part of that story is the relationship between Paul McCartney and George Harrison. Like any friendship that lasts decades, theirs wasn't perfect. They disagreed. They challenged one another. At times, they grew apart. But none of those moments erased what they had built together. When Paul speaks about George today, he rarely focuses on the conflicts that once filled newspaper headlines. Instead, he remembers the laughter, the creativity, the quiet brilliance of a friend who never stopped growing as a musician. George's songs remain a lasting part of that legacy. Something. Here Comes the Sun. While My Guitar Gently Weeps. These aren't just Beatles classics. They're timeless works that continue to inspire musicians and listeners across generations. Paul has never hesitated to acknowledge that. In interviews and public appearances, he has praised George's songwriting, his guitar playing, and the unique perspective he brought to the band. Those comments reveal something important. Respect often grows stronger with time. As years pass, old disagreements lose their importance. What remains are the memories, the shared experiences, the gratitude. Paul has also continued celebrating George's legacy through performances and special events, ensuring that new audiences discover the music his friend created. Rather than allowing the past to be defined by conflict, he has helped tell a fuller story, one that recognizes both the challenges and the extraordinary bond they shared. Here's one final question. Which George Harrison song means the most to you? Is it Here Comes the Sun, Something, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, or another favorite? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear your choice. For young musicians, the story of Paul and George offers an important lesson. Great partnerships aren't built because people always agree. They're built because talented people push each other to improve. Sometimes that creates tension. Sometimes it creates unforgettable art. And sometimes it creates both. Looking back today, it's clear that George Harrison wasn't simply the quiet Beatle. He was an innovative songwriter, a gifted guitarist, and a thoughtful artist whose influence reached far beyond the band. And Paul McCartney's reflections over the years have helped remind the world of exactly that. Their friendship wasn't defined by its hardest moments. It was defined by everything they created together. by the lives they changed through music, and by a legacy that continues to unite people across cultures and generations. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe now for more true stories about the world's greatest musicians, actors, and cultural icons. And don't miss our next documentary, where we'll uncover another legendary partnership whose greatest story happened far away from the spotlight. Because sometimes the most meaningful words aren't spoken during the biggest moments. They're spoken years later, when time has turned memories into gratitude.